Chapter 20.
You spoke through my body once before, when you feared you would be lost in the land of the dead,
Malus thought as he stepped beneath the rough arch of the portal.
That peril is nothing compared to the one you face now. Come forth, Erenlich! Open the gate or perish in the storm!
The Highborn felt a tingle of nascent power wash over his body as he stepped up to the gateway. For all its rough-hewn appearance, he could sense that there were arcane mechanisms inlaid in the stone, waiting for the proper hand to summon them into use again. Malus held a blackened skull before him as he inched closer to the swirling vortex that raged beyond the arch.
Do you think me weak, Erenlich? Do you think I will not step into the fire? Then you are a fool. I will burn you with me. A Druki seeks death in the face of failure. Open the gate or die with me!
There was a buzzing in the air. Malus could feel the skull begin to tremble in his hands. This close to the storm, the Highborn could feel its warping pull against his skin, as though it were reaching out for him. Faces came and went in the shifting, nebulous clouds, cruel, twisting visages that leered hungrily through the archway. Whether they hungered more for the soul in the Highborn's body, or the shade bound in the wire-wrapped skull, Malus could not say. Blue fire began to lick across the surface of the relic, blowing fiercely over the curves of the skull, as though it were being forced into the heat of a forge. Malus could feel the lines of silver wire turn hot in his hands.
The end approaches, Ancient Shade. Are you ready to face those who wait beyond?
The back of the skull touched the raging energy beyond the gate, and the black, empty eye sockets blazed with furious life. Erenlich drove spikes of fire into Malus's brain, forcing himself into the Highborn's skull like a spearhead and thrashing angrily in the tortured paths of his brain. The Highborn's body went taut, and his head arched back, as it had in the stone circle of Kul Hadar. His mouth opened in a frozen scream, but jagged, blistering curses spewed forth instead. Malus felt Erenlich's spirit clench like a knotted fist inside his skull, and felt his body begin to bend backwards, away from the otherworldly storm.
No!
He raged, grappling with Erenlich in a contest of terrible wills.
You think to master this body, foul spirit? Fool! You cannot master me. I am Malus of Haggrave, and I bend to no one! Do as I command, sorcerer, or meet your doom.
For a moment, the Highborn's body trembled, caught between opposing forces. Then, inch by painful inch, Malus's frame began to straighten again. The stream of raging curses slurred into a wordless growl of determination as Malus forced himself to take a tiny half-step forward and pressed the skull deeper into the vortex. An agonized shrieking filled the air. The storm penetrated the skull, lashing at Erenlich and by extension into Malus. The spirit of the sorcerer gibbered and wailed at the touch of the storm, and Malus's mind shrank from the impossible vistas that unfolded in his mind. Skies of liquid fire and seas of boiling skin. Terrible creatures with bones of ice and eyes that had beheld the first night of the world. And beyond them, more terrible spirits still. Ancient beings of incalculable wisdom and cruelty who stirred from their meditations and gazed across the immense gulf of the storm at the two beings struggling fitfully at its edge. And then the words burst from Malus's bloody lips, buzzing, shrieking words of power and intent that try to wake the arcane mechanism of the portal and hold the great storm at bay. The skull jerked in the Highborn's hand, and he felt more than heard the crack that raced along the curve of the brain case. Molten silver was running in hot droplets down the wire mesh, propelled away from the storm and falling toward Malus, splashing its sizzling droplet against his breastplate. The Highborn dimly sensed the engines of the portal trying to awaken, but something was wrong. They had lain idle too long, with no hand to tend them, and now the paths that directed the Shade's power were spinning out of control. There was a groaning sound in the air, and Malus saw the irregular arch start to twist and deform like heated wax. A shudder passed through Malus's soul. Its terrible storm was swelling. At first, he thought it was because the arch was failing. But then he realized that the raging energies were being pushed aside by the passage of those ageless beings, as sea dragons shoulder aside the freezing waters of the ocean. They were reaching across the storm. They were reaching for him. Erenlis's cries had reached an agonizing crescendo. Bloody froth burst from Malus's throat as the torrent of incantations poured into the air. He could feel the Shade's stark terror. It, too, felt the rising of the Ageless Ones, and in a fleeting moment of clarity, Malus caught a glimpse of the fate that awaited Erenlis, and even his hardened soul quailed at the thought of it. The air wavered in the air and flew apart into molten gobbets of rock that were sucked into the hungry maw of the storm. The great sorceress engines failed in a clap of thunder and a blaze of terrible light, and a huge clawed hand coalesced from the energies of the storm itself, closing about the sizzling surface of the skull. The bone turned to dust at the touch of that impossible hand, and the silver wire flared into mist, and the otherworldly storm that had seethed beyond the gate vanished as though it had never been, taking the Shade of Erenlis with it. Malus fell to his knees in the place where the Gate of Infinity had once stood. Steam curled from the joints in his armour. It felt like an eternity before he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat again, or put intent into coherent thoughts in his numbed mind. When he could focus his eyes again, Malus could see a white road of skulls stretching ahead of him to a huge stone edifice made of enormous slabs of the blackest basalt. It was a square, tiered structure, with no windows or carven images that hinted at the glories held within. It was a temple of power, a place built not for venerating the unseen, but to serve the ambitions of the worldly. The very sight of it lit the flames of desire in Malus's savage breast. The Highborn rose to his feet, suppressing flashes of pain with a ruthless effort of will. Here was a triumph beyond all imaginings. He could sense it calling out to him. With the power secreted within the temple, he would bend the entire world to his will. Someone was calling his name. Malus turned, trying to focus on the sound. "My lord! They're coming!" It was Lunara. She and the rest of the warband sat astride their cold ones, facing back down the road from whence they'd come. Just at the bend of the road, nearly 100 yards away, Malus saw the beastmen Herd had gathered. A tremor went through their massed ranks, and isolated voices howled challenges at the distant riders. Malus guessed the mob had seen the storm come undone, and they were now working up the courage to attack. The Highborn glanced back at the temple. Sure enough, a low wall surrounded the structure, broken by what appeared to be a single gate. Malus raced forward and leapt into Spite's saddle. "To the temple!" he cried, hauling on the reins. The warband turned as one and raced down the road, and the beastmen Herd broke into bloodthirsty cries and charged after them. In moments, the Cold Ones were racing through the plain gate of the temple wall, turning left and right across broad stone tiles, worked with runes and carvings of demonic skulls. "By the gate!" Malus ordered. He checked the height of the walls. There were no parapets, but a Druki standing on a cold one's back could peer over it.
Lunara, get the men against the wall. They can fire over it when the herd tries to force the gate.
Van Heer and Alvar pushed heavy gates made from basalt slabs into place. Thick iron bars fitted into holes in the bottom of each gate thudded into place into corresponding holes carved into the road. "This won't hold them forever, not if they bring hammers," Van Heer told Malus. "What do we do when they breach the gate?" Beyond the gateway, the road ran straight up to a simple entryway at the side of the great temple. Malus had already slid from the saddle and was walking swiftly towards the shadowy portal.
"Hold them off,"
the Highborn said simply, and disappeared inside. Malus's footsteps echoed hollowly down the narrow processional leading into the temple proper. No torches lined the walls, nor ironwork stands holding globes of greenish witchfire. Instead, the black wall seemed to radiate a kind of power that thinned the darkness somehow, like water added to ink. He could see clearly in any direction, but the weight of abyssal darkness hung about his shoulders all the same. The silence in the great temple was palpable, like the funereal stillness of a tomb, and yet the Highborn could sense a faint tremor of power suffusing the air. It was not so fierce and uncontrolled as the storm that had raged outside. Rather, it seemed ruthlessly harnessed and infinitely patient, waiting to be summoned to life. The processional led to a large square chamber, similarly devoid of ornamentation. Row upon row of humped shapes lined the floor, to either side of the aisle, and it took a moment for Malus to realize that they had once been the shapes of servants. In life they had worn metal vestments and mantles of some kind, and those ceremonial clothes still remained, bent in positions of supplication towards the narrow aisle. The Highborn wondered what kind of power, or awesome numbing fear, could drive more than 100 slaves to bend their heads to the stone floor and remain there, waiting in vain for the return of their terrible overlords, until finally they died there. The same could be said for the two massive suits of armour that still stood to either side of the doorway at the far end of the chamber. Their occupants had long since fallen to dust, but their empty armour still maintained their endless vigil. Malus passed through the doorway into what appeared to be a large chamber for prayers and sacrifices to the 4 gods of the north. Great statues stood at 4 different points within the room, each with its own stained altar. The darkness here was palpable, pressing against him like 100 clammy hands, sticky with blood. The great statues of the ruinous powers glared down at him with implacable hate, demanding his subservience and adoration. Muttering a prayer to the Dark Mother, the Highborn crossed the room without sparing the idols more than a passing glance, and stepped through a doorway. The space beyond was nothing less than cavernous. Heat and the stench of sulphur smote his face and neck. Malus stepped onto a floor of slate tiles that stretched across an open area the size of a small plaza back at the Hag. Ahead, he could see a dim red glow through the haze of darkness, silhouetting a huge shape that seemed to descend from the vastness of the ceiling above. Malus walked for nearly 50 yards across the tiles, until he reached the edge of a precipice. The statue of an immense winged demon crouched at the very brink, its horned forehead bent to the tiles in a gesture of supplication. Frowning, the Highborn stepped around the statue and peered into the abyss beyond. Hundreds of feet below was nothing but fire and seething molten stone, and a line of flat-topped boulders that seemed to hang in the air above the magma. The Highborn glanced at the large shape hanging above the fiery pit and saw that it, too, was an enormous, rough-hewn pillar of stone, carved with wide stairs that spiraled upwards to the temple's next level. Fortunately, they were also more than 30 yards away. Malus stepped back and regarded the statue of the demon once more. He noticed that its knobby back could also be seen as a set of cunningly carved steps. Carefully, he placed one boot on top of the demon's head and took a step up. The stone easily supported his weight. The Highborn climbed in the short flight of steps along the demon's back until there was nothing but reeking air before him. Peering down, he saw the first of the floating boulders, perfectly in line with the statue's back.
A bit ostentatious,
Malus thought, staring up at the distant staircase.
but effective.
The sorcerers were jealous of their power indeed. The question was how to make the boulders rise for him.
Force of will.
Malus thought.
What is sorcery, after all, but bending the world to one's will? How else did Kulhadar and Erenlish fight one another? How else did I force Erenlish to obey my commands?
Malus looked down at the stepping stones.
Rise,
he thought, focusing his will on them.
Rise!
The stones remained where they were.
Rise, damn you!
Malus thought fiercely, adding his rage to the force of his thoughts.
In the name of dead Erenlish, obey your new master! Rise!
Nothing happened. A growl escaped Malus's lips. He cast about for another name to hurl at the implacable rock.
In the name of Tz'arkan, rise!
At once, Malus felt the power in the air thrum like a plucked cord. The stepping stones trembled and then began to rise. The Highborn smiled triumphantly.
Tz'arkan, eh? What kind of name is that, I wonder?
The stepping stones rose smoothly and silently through the air, their faceted lower halves glowing from the heat of the magma below. They formed a perfect set of steps that curved upwards and met the stairs high above the blazing pit. Steeling himself, Malus stepped from the demon's back onto the first stone, and was gratified to discover it was as stable as the very earth. In minutes, the Highborn climbed the floating boulders to the staircase. As he stepped from each one, the stone plummeted back to its original position deep in the pit. By the time he reached the curving staircase, Malus felt like a petty god himself. The steps themselves appeared to be carved from alabaster. Each riser worked with the cunning relief of a dozen small naked figures, writhing in torment. Their faces were upturned, pleading for mercy, even as their shoulders and back supported the weight of each stair.
This is a place made for conquerors,
Malus thought. His smug grin faded a third of the way up the stair when he stumbled upon the body. It wore robes of a finer cut and a jewelled mantle that was similar to, but far richer than, those in the entry chamber below. And the hot, dry air had mummified the corpse almost perfectly. Malus was struck by the corpse's gaping mouth, frozen in a rictus of terror. Nor did he miss the curved dagger in the body's right hand, and the long, neat cuts along the withered veins of both forearms. There were bodies everywhere, perfectly preserved by the heat. All of them had died violent deaths, slain by one another or dead by their own hand. The second floor of the temple was given order to 5 large sanctums and the smaller quarters of the attendants who ministered to the needs of Erenlish and his cabal. Huge broad columns of basalt, carved in the likeness of terrible demons, supported the arched ceiling, and cold braziers made of bronze and dark iron stood at regular intervals along the broad corridors. Inserts of dark sandstone had been fitted among the black granite blocks of the walls. Each panel contained a bas-relief of corpse-choked fields or ruined cities burning beneath the twin moons. The doorway to each sanctum was carved with thick bands of magical runes, though the violence that marred the entire floor had made itself felt against these guardians' wards as well. The bands of runes were broken by the blows of hammers and axes, though on 2 occasions Malus also found the blackened husks of the servants who'd tempted their master's arcane power. The rooms themselves were torn apart. Ancient brown bloodstains marked the thick tapestries lining the walls and lay in pools across the marble floors. All of the rooms were piled with riches. Urns full of gold and silver coins sat amid broken bookshelves and piles of ancient books. Malus could only imagine the sorcerous wisdom contained within those pages. What would Nagaira or Uriel have given for 1 hour alone in these rooms? Suits of armour and fine weapons lay scattered along the floor, evidently ignored in the frenzy of slaughter that came upon the sorcerer's servants. At one point, Malus stumbled into a servant's room that had been turned into a slaughterhouse. A large oaken table had been drawn into the centre of the sparsely furnished room, and a wide assortment of cleavers and saws had been laid by its side. A mummified corpse still lay tied to the table, its right leg and arm sawn away.
They ran out of food when Erenlish and his army failed to return,
Malus thought.
Why didn't the stepping stones work for them? Surely they had better knowledge of the workings of this place than I.
The aura of power was much stronger here. It pulsed along the walls and hummed along his bones.
Perhaps that is what eventually drove them mad,
Malus thought.
Trapped here, slowly starving to death, and that tremor constantly running through one's body. It would be enough to drive me to murder.
Seeing the sanctums of the lost sorcerers finally brought home the realization that whatever power the temple contained, it was not meant to travel. This wasn't some magical sword or arcane relic like Erenlish's skull. Perhaps a source of power tied to the land, like Hadar's crystals. Clearly the Cabal was able to draw upon its strength from a great distance, but if they had living quarters in the temple, it seemed they couldn't be separated from it for very long. The notion vexed Malus.
I'll have to find some way to make it work for me as well,
he thought, but couldn't imagine how.
I may have to treat with that treacherous goat Hadar after all. Give him access to the temple and the power, and entrust him with its safekeeping.
Putting so much trust in the Beastman seemed the height of lunacy, but what else could he do?
I'll taste of the power for just a short time, enough to deal with my family and become Volkar, and that will be enough,
Malus thought. It was a bitter drink to swallow, but the history of Erenlish and his Cabal hinted that the power didn't come without cost. Better a brief flirtation and escape, rather than the kind of obsession that consumed one from the inside out. There was a ramp at one end of the level, surrounded by the quarters of the 5 sorcerers, that led upwards to the 3rd tier of the temple. The ramp itself was carved with skulls and worked with hundreds of runes, and the doors were formed of solid gold.
10 years' worth of raiding couldn't purchase all that gold,
Malus thought with avaricious wonder.
I could pull those down, break them up and return to the hag, a wealthy man. But then, if those are merely the doors, what manner of glories lie beyond?
The great doors were perfectly balanced, and swung open at the slightest touch. Beyond lay a large chamber dominated by a tall pair of basalt doors, flanked by huge statues of fearsome winged demons. The floor was made of polished basalt slabs, blacker than night, and inlaid with an intricate series of interlocking magical wards worked with gold, silver, and crushed gems. The greatest of the wards was only a third of a much greater circle that evidently ran beneath the far wall and encompassed part of the chamber beyond the basalt doors. At the foot of the great doors lay a heap of mummified bodies. one with its arm still outstretched against the basalt slab. Long brown streaks of dried blood made 4 perfect lines that stretched from the door's golden handle to the mummy's ragged fingertips. The air here trembled with power. It tasted like copper and ash on Malus's tongue. He set ripples of it in motion as he stepped across the threshold, like he was wading out into an ocean of invisible energy. It lapped around him, plucking at his hair and roiling with his breath. The feel of it left him giddy with greed, but a small part of him was also troubled. So much strength here. Why couldn't those wretches bend it to their will? He crossed the lines of the wards with great care, even though they had been worked in such a fashion that no mere man could harm them. When he stepped across the first of the rune-inlaid barriers, he felt a new kind of power settle over him, like an iron fist closing around his chest. It was so potent that for a moment he thought he couldn't breathe. And then he realized that his heart wasn't beating either. Once, in his early years of flirtation with Nagaira, she had taken him into her sanctum and showed him some of her oldest magical tomes. One of them was about wards of stasis and binding, the magical art of trapping spirits and objects in one place and holding them there until the spell expired. He was standing in such a ward now, in layers of them, each one supplying energy to the others in a weave of incredible complexity and strength. Standing within the wards effectively stopped his body from one heartbeat to the next. He could stand here for thousands of years and not die. With a creak of ancient, leathery skin, one of the mummies turned to stare at Malus with yellowed, rheumy eyes. The Highborn drew a sword, watching in horror as 5 bodies, not living, but certainly not dead, rose awkwardly to their feet. 2 of the figures brandished knives, while the rest reached out to him with gnarled, wrinkled hands. They tried to speak, their desiccated mouths working, but only a thin whistle of air leaked from their ruined lungs. They staggered towards him, their faces contorted with a mixture of anger, fear, and greed. The first mummy to reach him swung its dagger wildly at the Highborn's head. Malus rocked back on his heels, dodging the blow, then leaned back in and slashed at the creature's knife arm. The limb tore away in a puff of dust, but the mummy simply dropped its shoulder and rushed at him, knocking Malus off his feet. His sword hand cracked against the basalt tile, and the blade went skittering across the floor. A rotted hand groped for Malus's throat, and the mummy's face was inches from his own, still uttering its thin, whistling cry. The other creatures were on him moments later, tearing at him with their hands. The Highborn caught sight of the second knife-wielding mummy, circling around to stab at his unarmoured head. Paper-dry fingers closed around his neck. The other mummy's knife flashed downwards, and Malus pulled the other one-armed mummy into its path. The blade plunged into the back of the one-armed mummy's skull with a sound like a cracking eggshell, showering the Highborn with stinking dust and flecks of dry skin. Malus pulled his leg up underneath the one-armed mummy and kicked the withered corpse back over his head, crashing it into its knife-wielding companion. Both were knocked off balance and fell backwards, landing outside the boundaries of the wards. They hit the floor and exploded into dust, as the status effect of the magical barriers deserted them. The other mummies recoiled from Malus with wordless cries of despair as they saw the fate of their companions. The Highborn rolled to his feet, recovered his sword, and remorselessly attacked the ancient figures. Within moments, their limbless torsos were hurled across the barrier and dashed into dust.
What madness is this?
Malus thought, wiping the brownish powder from his face.
They lingered for centuries trying to open those doors, and yet, when I appeared to try the same, they attacked me. Was it out of greed? Or fear? Or both?
Malus stepped towards the doors. He felt the power flow past him like a receding wave, retreating into the chamber beyond. There was a faint click, and the basalt doors swung silently open. The room beyond looked like nothing so much as a vast treasure chamber. Piles of gold and silver, jewels and ornate relics lay heaped everywhere, surrounding an enormous faceted crystal set in the centre of the room. Unlike the green crystals that the beastmen held sacred, this stone was lit with a shifting bluish glow, not unlike the ambience of the northern lights. The aura of power coalesced around the crystal, sending arcs of blue lightning flickering over its surface. At last, Malus approached the crystal, eyes gleaming with anticipation.
You were so certain I would fail, sister. You had no idea with whom you were dealing.
The highborn laughed, gazing at the fabulous wealth that surrounded him.
Gold enough to beg a hag grave, he thought, and it is only the beginning.
His eyes alighted on a gold ring, set with an oblong ruby almost as long as his finger. The flickering light of the crystal played across its surface, giving it a deep colour of fresh blood. Malus plucked the ring from the pile of treasure, savouring its weight and the rich colour of the gem.
A ring of blood befitting a conqueror, he thought. The Dark Mother grant this is only the first of the glories that will be mine.
Malus slid the ring upon his finger. The instant it settled into place, the power that surrounded the crystal struck the highborn full in the chest. Fire and ice and black corruption seared along his bones. It was a sensation greater than pain and terror and madness combined. The power that flooded him was coldly, cruelly aware. It was as merciless as a winter storm, as relentless as an avalanche. The highborn's will wasn't merely broken, it was swept away as though it had never been. Malus screamed in agony and soul-numbing terror as the terrible power hollowed out his soul in a single awful instant. He fell to his knees, and only then became aware of the thunderous laughter echoing through his mind. Darkness threatened to overwhelm him. Then a voice reverberated through his skull, whispering with all the intimacy of a lover.
It is you who are the fool, Malus Darkblade, for want of a bauble